Sydney has quite a varied public transport system, from its suburban and intercity train networks with their iconic double-deckers, to its extensive bus and ferry systems, and of course its recently opened metro and light rail lines. But back in the day there was one other mass transit mode present in the city that's no longer around. That being the Sydney Monorail.
There's nothing on earth like a genuine bona fide electrified 6-car monorail!
The Sydney Monorail was a weird experiment of a line that promised big things that never quite panned out. So in this video I'm going to be asking why it was built in the first place, as well as what stopped it from ushering in a futuristic new age for transport in the city. I'm also going to look at if it ever actually stood a chance of forming a key part of Sydney's mass transit system, and if there's any chance we could see the monorail return in the future. Hi all, I'm City Moose, and I make videos about public transport infrastructure and urbanism in Australia and potentially across the globe, so consider subscribing to the channel if that sort of thing interests you. I also have a Ko-fi if you'd like to support the channel, it is always appreciated. But now, let's get back on board the monorail. The story of the Sydney Monorail starts with the redevelopment of the Darling Harbour precinct near the city's central business district or CBD. Darling Harbour used to be, as its name suggests, a working harbour, and was home to various docks, railways, warehouses and other industrial buildings. But with the rise of container shipping it simply couldn't keep up with the amount of space that was needed, and Sydney's main port moved away from the city to Botany Bay. This left the Darling Harbour precinct without much of a purpose, and it was taking up precious real estate right next to the CBD. As a result, it was decided that it, along with the rest of the then quite industrial Pyrmont Peninsula, should be redeveloped. Pyrmont would be transformed into a mix of residential and office buildings, while Darling Harbour would become a new recreational and tourism precinct. Now, for this new precinct to be successful, it would need a way for people to get to it. And while these days Pyrmont has a light rail line, a ferry stop and a metro station that's currently under construction, back then the area was pretty lacking for basic public transport options. So the state government investigated a few potential options to solve this, mainly monorail, but light rail was considered as well, although it is worth noting that this light rail proposal was quite a bit different to the one we ended up getting with the current L1 line. Ultimately though, monorail was what the government ended up going with, and there were some solid reasons for this selection. Firstly, it was pretty cheap to build, coming in at just around $60 million, which would be about $160 million in today's money, so a fair bit cheaper than a lot of other transport projects we've seen recently. On top of that, the line was mostly built and paid for privately, making it even more tempting for a government that, at the time, was far more interested in spending money on road infrastructure than public transport. Speaking of that preference for road transport, the monorail also wouldn't really interfere that much with the city's streets. Being elevated, it ran above the surface traffic, where other options like the light rail might have had to take road space away from cars. As you can see here, the narrow beams used in its construction didn't take up much space at all, and were small enough to simply be placed on the footpath instead. In addition, the line was pretty quick to build, taking just over a year. However, despite these benefits, there were some that viewed the decision to go with a monorail over light rail as a more political choice rather than a practical one. Reporting by the Sydney Morning Herald at the time described the government's investigations into building light rail as basically just cosmetic, with at least one former minister telling the paper that they didn't believe the light rail option was given a fair go. The paper also described the then Minister of Planning, Bob Carr, as having complained that the then Minister of Public Works, Laurie Brereton, had been unfair to the light rail proposal, and that he believed light rail could have been installed easily and with minimal disruptions. The paper even noted that the light rail could have been built for $20 million less than the monorail was. But in the end, the novelty of what seemed like a futuristic new form of transport that could be built and paid for by a private operator was too tempting for the state government and won their approval, with the line opening in 1988 to quite a bit of fanfare. The line was operated as a single direction loop, starting at a station called City Centre, which was conveniently located roughly in the centre of the Sydney CBD, and also connected up with the City Centre shopping arcade. From here the line headed counterclockwise to its next station at Darling Park on the newly opened up eastern foreshore of Darling Harbour. After this, the line ran across Pyrmont Bridge. As part of the redevelopment of Darling Harbour, this bridge, which used to be a key road artery into the city, was pedestrianised, freeing up space for the monorail to run above it. Interestingly, the Piedmont Bridge is a swing bridge, meaning it could open and close to allow boats to pass, and the monorail track running along the bridge could open and close too. Although it didn't have to if the boat wasn't that big, so you could have instances like this where the bridge swung open while the monorail track stayed in place. After crossing the bridge, the monorail reached its next stop at Harbourside, which was a shopping centre built as part of the redevelopment, but that was actually demolished just last year. From here, the line headed south for stops at the city's then new convention and exhibition centres, stops which would eventually become interchanges with the light rail when it opened in the late 90s. The line then turned eastwards for a stop at what was originally called Haymarket, then was renamed to Powerhouse Museum, before getting its final name of Paddy's Markets, which would also allow for an interchange with the light rail when it opened. From here, the line turned north for stops at World Square and the Galleries Victoria, which was originally called Park Plaza, both of which were also major shopping precincts. This brings us to the end of the loop, which the monorail would run around in a counterclockwise direction, usually taking about 12 minutes to do a full circle. But after the Sydney Monorail's opening, things didn't get off to a particularly good start. Ridership ended up being just half what was originally estimated, and of those riders, only 9% were actual regular commuters, meaning the system had essentially just turned into a glorified tourist trap. On top of that, even before the line opened, there were a lot of people opposed to it, primarily for aesthetic reasons, including then independent MP and current Mayor of Sydney, Clover Moore, who called it the most offensive structure to assault our city since the Cahill Expressway. Though personally, I never minded the look of it. If it was successful in one area, it was having that cool sort of 80s futurism aesthetic. But why was the line struggling to attract significant ridership outside of the tourist crowd? Well, some people pin the line's problems on the simple fact it was a monorail. But in my view, the actual design of the line was flawed from the start. For starters, the line lacked proper connections with the rest of Sydney's rail network. The closest it came to one was with the Galleries Victoria station that was pretty close to Town Hall, but again, not actually connected to it. This made transferring to the line pretty inconvenient. Additionally, the line and its private operator used their own ticketing systems separate from the rest of the city's transport network, which again only increased the inconvenience of transferring between the two systems. And on top of that, the ticket prices for the monorail were relatively expensive, coming in at $5 for a single trip by the time the line closed. It is also worth noting that trips on the monorail tended to be pretty short, which made their priciness even less appealing to regular commuters, especially when you account for the fact that almost every journey made on the system could be walked fairly easily. Walking from the city centre station to Harbourside station, for example, would only take about 15 minutes. But probably one of the biggest issues preventing the line from actually being useful was the fact it was a single direction loop. If you were someone who, for example, commuted into Town Hall Station by train but worked in an office in Piedmont, the monorail would do an okay job of taking you to your office. But coming back home, you would have to take a much slower and longer route. All of this was not helped in the late 90s, when the line that we now call the L1 light rail line opened, because it runs along much the same route as the monorail through Darling Harbour, the monorail's key destination, and the light rail had a much more convenient connection with the rest of Sydney's rail network, having a stop directly in Central Station. That said, as time went on, Sydney's monorail continued to see mixed results. The line suffered a few breakdowns that left travellers stranded in the air for hours and needing to be rescued, which probably didn't help entice more commuters onto it. There was even a collision between two of the trains in 2010 that saw 4 people needing to be hospitalised, although there were thankfully no deaths. It wasn't all negative, however. In 2001 the line had a new station added to it in Chinatown, and eventually the line did become somewhat profitable, primarily due to its popularity with tourists. It even introduced the first debit card fare system for public transport in the country. But that wasn't enough to save the line from its fate. While it was making a small operating profit, it was getting old and would soon be needing a lot of expensive maintenance and upgrades that the government and its private owners had no desire to foot the bill for. Additionally, there were plans to expand the exhibition and convention centres, as well as build the CBD and South East Light Rail project, and these plans needed the space that the monorail was taking up. So in 2012, the state government acquired the line from its private owners, and in 2013 they closed it for demolition. Which does sadly bring us to the end of the story of the Sydney Monorail, that never quite managed to revolutionise transport in Sydney, or even really between the CBD and Darling Harbour. But at least it did kind of manage to look cool. You can still see remnants of the old system lying about the city. If you take the pedestrian crossing between Piermont Bridge and Market Street for example, you'll pass by what used to be Darling Park Station. Ultimately, this line was kind of doomed from the start. Its design was never going to let it be a useful commuter service, and as time went on, other systems like the L1 Light Rail came along that were simply better at getting people from the city to Darling Harbour. Personally, I am a bit sad that it's not around anymore. Not because it was particularly useful, but because it was a cool transport oddity and not a terrible way for a tourist to see the city for $5. That said, it doesn't look like Sydney will be seeing a monorail again anytime soon. There have been some recent proposals to build monorails elsewhere in Australia, like one to the Melbourne airport, or even one that could have seen Sydney's monorail relocated to Hobart, but none of these ideas ever went anywhere. The focus these days seems to be on building out the metro and the light rail, which, to be fair, have proven to be more successful than the monorail ever did. That's not to say monorails could never be successful in the city. Their relatively high speeds, low construction costs, and small ground footprint could still be quite useful in Sydney, where roads are often quite narrow, making that small ground footprint quite useful. Monorails are also better at climbing hills than other types of rail transport, which could be quite valuable given Sydney can be quite hilly. If they do ever make a comeback though, I would hope the focus would be more on building out dual direction lines that provide suburban to CBD connections, rather than a tiny CBD based loop. But if that ever does end up happening, I doubt it will be anytime soon. And for now, Sydney's monorail will just have to live on in the memories of the various tourists and locals who got a chance to ride it. Well, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, consider giving it a like and subscribing to the channel, and if you really enjoyed it, you could also support me on Ko-fi. But as always, I'm Kyle, aka City Moose, and thanks for watching.